I already made a video about using multiple HTTP clients in your Blazor apps. In the Blazor app, you get this HTTP client out of the box, which you can configure to communicate with your API. And then you can easily inject it in any component and use the CRUD operations to get data or to post data, put or delete data. With this extra package, you can easily specify the HTTP client as follows. You can add a named client, set the base address, or you can add a typed client by specifying the class in here. So let's say weather forecast service, and you could even do like this. Those two, the first one and the last one, are about the same, so I'm gonna group them together, which basically just return a newly initialized client. Let's make it a bit more. Now you see those two are basically the same, just returning a newly configured HTTP client, and you can simply inject those wherever you need, at the top of a page, in a class, wherever you need it. And it's going to use that base address. You'll likely want to change that to the address of your API. I'm going to remove this one to reduce the clutter. Just know that you can do it like that, and that you can use that HTTP client factory to create a new client, which is actually what also happens under the hood when you use the add HTTP named client. And adding a typed client is not much different than a named client. I quickly added this class down below. That's not recommended, but just to show you. And then we inject that HTTP client, and then we can just easily use it in our methods. To use that named client, you could do inject the HTTP client factory that we saw before. Let's call it. And then you create a new client and you target that same name, so the named client, and that returns a new HTTP client instance with the configuration of this named client. So that would be the base address would be set, and then you can use that in your method or on your component. It's gonna be similar. On the component, that would look like injecting the HTTP client factory instead. So let's see, p client, and that would just be the same. To say HTTP is HTTP client factory dot create client, and you could target that named client again. You could just replace just like that. So if you have multiple APIs, so multiple different unique base addresses to target, you cannot no longer use the top one. That's where the trouble starts, because now this HTTP client, if we were to use that just in the component, and we actually want to target the first HTTP client, so with the API URL of 1, then that's going to be problematic, because likely the base address will be overwritten. So for that, we could either use the named client or the typed client. Let's start with the named client. Let's get rid of these top ones since we can't use it. And let's copy over the URLs. And let's just make 2 named clients. And call it named client 1 and named client 2. And that should be possible now to use that HTTP. Let's see if we can get it back. Client factory again. Target the correct named client. So let's say we want named client 1. And then that should be possible to, then we should just be able to do a HTTP call with this named client 1 with the correct base address. So that's fine. And we could make another one. Let's call this HTTP2. And then that's named client 2. Now we can target the 2 separate APIs. We have more control over which HTTP client to use to do the calls. And that's a bit similar with the typed client. You could simply specify the base address in here. And then we could have another service that implements the other one. Let's call it walking service, just saying something. And then we could use URL 2. And now this one's responsible for calling the second API, and this one's responsible for calling the first API. And of course we need to add our second service as well, as scoped or as using this add HTTP client. That's fine. Let's call this walking service. I think you can even set dot base address equals new URI, and let's like that, and then clean this up. And of course you can easily use these typed clients as well on the component. That would look more like that. You make a method, you use that HTTP client which has that base address, and then you likely want to get some data. To use that, of course, you inject that weather service. I didn't move it to its own class, which would have been better to actually use it. But let's just, for the demo, keep it like that. And then you could do, if it works, of course, weather forecast service. Of course, need to do get forecasts. I still see a couple of problems with both approaches. So let's say this is just a sample application, but a real application will probably look more like the following, where you have a dozen services. To just show you one of my applications where I have a service basically doing all of the create, read, update, delete calls over HTTP to my API. But yeah, that's grouped per feature or per entity. And these all have the same base URL, so that's fine. But each time, so for each service, that's going to create a new HTTP client. So that's kind of problematic when we want to set a property on the client. For example, that authorization header. If we want to set that after the user logged in and everything went fine, and from then on all the following HTTP calls we want to have authorized. So then we can set that default header. But the problem now is, yeah, we have a dozen clients we need to set that header on, not just the weather forecast service. So that's a problem. And you have the same problem with the named client, because each time you want to use this, you have to basically create a new client, like you saw here on the component. So, and that each time returns a new HTTP client instance. So that would also be very hard to suddenly authorize all of them or multiple. It would be really cool if we could just do, instead of having to do create client, like get client to get that exact client that you specified on the program CS, so the named client 1 or 2, and in this way just reuse that specific HTTP client all over your application. That would actually solve a lot of problems that I'm currently having and would make my solution redundant. So maybe I should try to build something like that myself. And the best solution I came up with after browsing the internet is by isolating the HTTP client configuration and that instance. So by creating a new class, I called it walking HTTP client for these services. And that injects the HTTP client factory and basically creates a named client, but stores it in a property that is then exposed. And this can have the configuration. And if we later want to authorize, we can target that client, and then every class that injects this HTTP client will then have an authenticated HTTP client if one of those services calls this method after the user logged in, and so on. And how you would use that is simply similar, but instead of the regular HTTP client, you're going to use the walking HTTP client and target that client property. And now if we were to have walking service 1, let's see, walking service 1, that is now going to use the exact same instance of the HTTP client. And of course I had to add that walking HTTP client as scoped, register that so that all of the walking services can use that same instance of the walking HTTP client. So that would work. So for many services that need to call that same API, and once one of them got authenticated, then all of them can do authenticated calls. The only unfortunate thing is that you kind of have to change use the instance of the walking HTTP client, and you can no longer use that regular HTTP client. I'm basically saying whenever you're injecting this HTTP client on the component in a class, wherever, use this client. So resolve this class with this instance. Unfortunately, we can't do that, because if we would do something similar somewhere else, but let's say we also have a weather forecast HTTP isolated client. If we would do that, it's going to get mixed up again. So unfortunately, we can't do that. Because if we could do that, then we could just, instead of having to inject a walking HTTP client, then we could just keep working with our HTTP client, and no other component really needs to know about this walking HTTP client. Which is a bit of a problem I'm having in my application. I implemented a module that I made in the brand website video series. Do watch that if you haven't. Now this module in the shared SPA is using that HTTP client, and I exactly had that problem. It was using the default HTTP client and control which HTTP client configuration it was using. It had to use that utils HTTP client. So similarly, as I just showed, like the walking HTTP client, isolated or an encapsulated HTTP client. That's using that. But now the problem starts. I need to pass the instance of that isolated HTTP client to that module. And I actually don't really want my module to know about it. So I need to find a way to do that. My module should be a standalone module, should not have to implement this utils HTTP client or the interface. So again, I couldn't simply say services.addScoped HTTP client and then provide that utils HTTP client. So get required service utils HTTP client and then .client, that instance. Unfortunately, I can't do that because the next time I do a similar thing with a different interface for another project or another module, these clients are going to override each other. So, but I did something similar. Let's see. It's actually more like I isolated HTTP client interface, I think. But I didn't want to have to add an extra line to make this module, to plug this module in. So I basically moved that into the extension method, and then in that extension method, so that's that function that is then going to add that utils HTTP client for this interface, and then I can use this interface in my, so similarly, like I showed you, isolate HTTP client and then the HTTP.client, and now that's going to actually use that utils HTTP client. Well, that's a problem for me to solve. I feel like I'm almost there, but not yet. So I'm going to finalize that, but not bother you with it. Then again, I wanted to say that's for my setup. So my setup looks like that, where I have each application that has a Blazor frontend, a shared SPA, which is a Razor class library holding most of the components, and that HTTP client, which should be configured to call its API, as you can see. And then each application is similar, but each needs to have their own unique HTTP client with the correct base address, and they can't override each other, of course. So that's why I need multiple HTTP clients for my setup. If it was just one application, let's say just one API, but multiple applications, then it's fine to just use that out-of-the-box HTTP client with just one base address. And you can authenticate that one with the header, set the headers, because you're just using the same one over your entire application. I hope you found this video valuable. It was a bit hard for me to explain because I didn't know where to start at the very beginning or just go right into the problem. I started at the beginning to explain how to use just the out-of-the-box HTTP client, how to use the named client, how to use the typed client, and what the problems are with the approaches. And then I provided a potential solution. One that I use in my applications is to create some kind of encapsulated or isolated HTTP client with a property that will store that instance, so all of your services can access that same HTTP client, and you can just authenticate that one instead of having to or trying to authenticate a dozen different HttpClient. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if this video was interesting or valuable in any way. And feel free to go to my website if you want the original code of my NuGet packages, which contain a ton of useful, reusable code that I use in all my projects. But I evolve these packages to my use cases, so if you want the original code to adjust to your needs, just sign up and I'll make sure you get them. And you may also become a Patreon member, where most of my code can be accessed once you join. I hope I see you in the next video.